Morning, everyone. We got a little Spanish, so bienvenidos. um, it's a great privilege to be here, not only to be part of the panel talking about the U.S. regional opportunities in the lithium space, but also a unique perspective from an operator's position. And so Galvanic Energy is currently operating in the Smackover formation in the central United States. We've literally covered coast to coast here in our panel. And so we're going to talk about the central part of the United States, Smackover formation, and a little bit about our history and how we came to be in this particular area. The title is Everything is Bigger in Texas. Now, I'm from Oklahoma. It's hard for me to even want to say that. But it is bigger in Texas for various reasons. And of course, that phrase may be overused at times. But when it comes to the resource, really the state has an advantage because of its just overall footprint, but because also the Smackover formation is mostly running across the state of Texas. So here's a geologic map. It's there's a number of them out there you can find on the internet if you go searching about the Smackover formation. I like this one as a geologist by training. Has a little bit more detail and information. When I'm looking at the Smackover formation and I'm thinking about its reservoir potential, and of course this is 10 to 12,000 feet deep. It's over 2 miles below the surface and developed a lot like oil and gas. But when I think about it, I'm thinking about where's the best reservoir potential. And there's an area in bright blue across kind of the top and wrapping around the Gulf Coast that's called the shoal system, the Smackover shoal system. It's a Nuidic shoal. You can get into all the geology and do some research on that, but it's the best potential part of the reservoir. It's where a lot of focus has been occurring thus far. In fact, Southwest Arkansas is where a lot of this activity first started off in the Smackover formation. I'll talk about some of those details here in just a moment. But recently, we started to see expansion opportunities and operations moving into Northeast Texas. And you're seeing this movement along this primary trend of the shoal system, mainly because it has the largest reservoir potential, the highest volume of brine, but it's also where we find the highest concentrations of lithium. There's debate as to why the lithium is higher concentrated in that particular area more than others, but it's also just because we have limited data, and the data that we have currently is focused in this particular region. And I'd imagine that as we get additional data and additional operations in the region, we're going to see expansion along this. We like to say in the oil and gas industry, when you have big resources become bigger. And so as we ultimately continue to explore and expand the operations, I think we're going to see a lot of development as it spreads out along this entire region. And so you see a little daisy chain, and you see that there's the potential to take what started in Arkansas, literally multiply it by 10 times, and that still doesn't account for the rest of the carbonate system and the rest of blue. I want to show this just for comparison so that we can get an idea of scale. The circle I put on there is the overall footprint of what's called the Permian Basin. If you're familiar in oil and gas, the Permian Basin in West Texas and bleeding a little bit over into southwest or southeast New Mexico. It's the largest oil producing region in the United States. Half of the U.S. Production comes out of a footprint that big. That's where half of the U.S. oil production is currently taking place. It's also a quarter of our natural gas production. And you think about that, and you think about its size compared to the rest of the Smackover formation. Smackover formation is immense. It's just an enormous potential reservoir, and it's going to require a lot of resources, a lot of investment, and it's not going to happen overnight. It's going to take a long time. The Permian Basin, to get to the point that it is today, took a century. It took hundreds of operators. It took thousands of service companies, and it took hundreds of thousands of workers to get it to where it is today. And so when we start thinking about that potential scale, and we think about U.S. opportunities to ultimately combat foreign entities that are working against us and trying to secure our own resources in the United States, the Smackover definitely offers a humongous opportunity for this country and for multiple businesses and regulatory environments to get involved. So last year in November, the USGS published a report, and the report was based on a couple of things. Number one, it was based on independent data that they collected from various operating wells in Southwest Arkansas. It also utilized log data that was collected by both the brine industry and especially the oil and gas industry to model out the reservoir. When they took the concentrations of the lithium and the volume of the brine, then entered it into an AI model and doing what's called machine learning, they were able to get a wide variety of Monte Carlo simulations to try to understand what is the potential resource in Southwest Arkansas. And again, they're just focusing on that highlighted red area of the entirety of the Smackover Formation. And what they ultimately came up with was about 5 million to 19 million tons of elemental lithium. And in the work that we did in years previous to that research effort at Galvanic Energy with the prospect that we had built and then later divested to ExxonMobil, and with Standard Lithium's independent work, we would think that these numbers are fairly well in line with what we saw in our smaller prospect areas. And so when you model across that and you think about, okay, go back to the daisy chain, and if you can multiply Southwest Arkansas by 10-fold, then what you're ultimately thinking about is a resource play that's potentially 50 to 200 million tons elemental lithium. That would make it the largest prospect in the world, especially a continuous reservoir that's interlinked. And so it's certainly nothing to be remiss in thinking about potential here. And it's a lot of footprints, a lot of space, and it's very inviting for a number of companies to come in here and to operate. So I want to think about the question of, well, how do you develop this? How do you develop such an immense resource? Well, just like the Permian, it's not going to happen overnight. As they say, Rome wasn't built in a day. Well, large oil and gas plays weren't built in a day, and large lithium resources aren't going to be built in a day either. It's going to take time, it's going to take investment, and it's going to take numerous entities to come in and apply their skills and workforces. But what I like to think about when I think about the model that we can follow, I would at least look at and consider the oil and gas model. The oil and gas model was even kind of referenced this morning by Simon. He talked about upstream and downstream. He said the downstream is there, but the upstream is where we're a little bit lacking. I would say actually we're probably lacking in both the upstream and the midstream. And the midstream I'd liken into those who are doing the conversion process, the DLE experts, the technology companies that are going to extract the lithium from the brine. The upstream has started. We're a part of that. Standard Lithium's a part of that. ExxonMobil's a part of that. Others as well. So we're starting to create the upstream. But just like in a new oil and gas play, the real question becomes is once you find and make the discovery, how do you get it out of the ground? Well, you got to drill wells. So you drill the wells, you bring it up out of the ground. The next question is where do you take it? And even in early oil and gas development and in new prospects in place, you've got to have a place to take that. You've got to have a market. Well, we know the downstream is there, the demand, the markets, they're there, but how do you ultimately convert a specialty chemical to get it to battery grade and bring it to that market? Well, we're going to need more of the midstream. So let's talk about what this would look like in the case of lithium exploration and operations. Well, we have the upstream. The upstream is done in a couple of different ways. There's a lot of companies that go out there and are working with existing infrastructure, such as in oil and gas, where already a huge byproduct of oil and gas production is brine. And some of it is definitely laced with high concentrations of lithium. But the problem is you're dependent on what their operation looks like and how much they produce to ultimately have your upstream for the brine production and lithium production. But you can also go out and build purpose-built brine fields. And that's what we do at Galvanic Energy. We've gone out, we've explored, we identify, and then we develop purpose-built brine fields. And so we have that. And then, of course, then we move into the DLE space. And I'll talk more about this, but notice that you can have difference of scale. You can have very large refineries or extraction facilities, and you can also have these smaller modular units. And we'll talk about why that's important. But then, of course, you have specialty chemicals and you have battery grade material being created at the downstream. So just a reminder, what's it look like at the surface? Well, we've shown this in the past, and we'll spend a lot of time belaboring this, but one of the key potential upsides to DLE type technology and developing these kind of resources, number one, they're really huge. So they should be looked at and considered. But number two, the footprint on the surface is really nominal. When you think about open pit mines and you think about the big salar evaporative ponds, obviously they take large footprints. They're very visible. In this picture on the right is just an example of what a brine well looks like. You may hear about them. I had to zoom in from the road just to be able to see it. It's not really obvious. You can drive right by it without even noticing it. But the footprint's small. The extraction facility is probably the most dominant thing. And then, of course, pipeline gets buried, and so it's not visible either. All of it's in the subsurface. It's just pipe going down to the reservoir with pumps downhole, bringing the fluid to the surface, and then returning it back by pipeline back into the wells and back down to recirculate. And so it's called a closed loop system. And so it's very efficient. It's very nominal footprint. And we think that's a tremendous upside to this particular approach to brine mining. But it's this midstream part that we really need to think about. Right now, I think it's the real choke point. We've got to get DLE operations out there and commercialize, and we need to scale them up quickly. Once we do that, then we're incentivized as operators to drill wells, bring a lot of brine into the process. But we've got to have somewhere to take it. We've got to have a means to process it so that it can find its way to the downstream. But when it comes to the scale, you hear about companies that are proposing 30,000 to 50,000 ton per annum lithium carbonate equivalent. Well, that's great, but that's going to require enormous footprints. And when we first started in our first project in Arkansas, what really attracted Exxon was scale. We put together 120,000 acres of contiguous acreage. That was unique. It was the only one of its kind. And so that attracted a large buyer. And in that particular case, though, it's also going to be a thing of the past because, as we'll see in a moment, other operators are now attracted to this space. That was a unique opportunity, once in a lifetime situation. Now we've got to work around other operators who are trying to do the same thing. And so in some cases, we're not going to be able to just work as independents building our own large facility. We're going to have to either work independently using smaller modular units, or we're going to need to work collectively using some kind of central processing facility. So there's a lot of opportunity here, and that's what I think is really exciting about this. We refer to this as the Smackover Lithium Belt, both of Northeast Texas and Southwest Arkansas. It's kind of continuous, east to west, about 200 miles long, 50 miles wide. There's a lot of operation going on currently today, but the important thing is what you already have in place here. It's important that you already have some infrastructure. Some of these lithium mines in the world are in some very remote places, and they're hard to access, and it's certainly hard to find a workforce unless you move them to those regions. We're surrounded and have down the corridor a number of small towns. You hear about El Dorado and Magnolia in Southwest Arkansas because that's where the operations have been in the past. There's other small towns, but there's some larger cities all surrounding this particular corridor. And then, of course, you have this huge Dallas-Fort Worth metroplex with 8.5 million people sitting right on its western boundary. And that's great because that means enormous workforce potential, a lot of technical skills and abilities. You've got universities, you've got service companies, you've got other support companies and providers. And then in this region, we have abundance of interstates, highways, railways. We have a lot of fresh water supply, both at the surface and in the subsurface. Obviously, energy is abundant in Texas, and therefore it leads to low energy costs. And we have energy both that is conventional, such as oil and gas, coal, but we also have renewable energy. We have both solar fields and wind farms all around this particular area. And so I go back to the example of oil and gas just for a moment, back to the Permian Basin of West Texas. And I said a moment ago, it was unique that we had the opportunity to put together and consolidate a large land position that ultimately attracted ExxonMobil. But going forward, it's not going to be the case. And in our current project, we're already seeing this. But like in the Permian and the West Texas, lots of operators really coalesce together. They're all intertwined, and they have to learn to work together. Now, I don't say that in the sense of collusion. Obviously, there is very competitive. It's a very competitive nature out there. But there has to be a certain sense of cooperation. And that's where the regulatory agencies, such as the Railroad Commission of Texas, comes in to help make sure we all play nicely together. Well, the great thing about Railroad Commission is after a century of developing the oil and gas operations in places like the Permian Basin, they've helped to get companies to work together and to operate in a very positive and meaningful way. And I refer to it as not collaboration or competition. I call it co-opetition. We compete a little bit, but we got to collaborate a little bit, and we've all got to work together because rising tides lift all ships. In the case of lithium, we don't need to be cutthroat at this point. It's too early in the game. What we need to do is figure out how we can work together, work with our regulatory agencies, and continue to push forward early development so we can get to the point of developing an outstanding United States resource to help with energy independence. And so back to the example of this Smackover lithium belt, the first brine units that were put together were for really bromine back in the late 1960s, early 1970s. Albemarle has a position there developing bromine, has talked about developing lithium, but has yet to do that. Standard Lithium cooperatively works with Tetra and Lanxess to take their tail brine from their bromine processes. That's where you hear about their pilot project. We came in, we built a lithium exclusive brine unit of 120,000 acres that we later divested to ExxonMobil. And then once the news got out about that, obviously other operators came in and started to fill out the space. And then came the development as everyone marched westward along this particular trend. But in the future, we're going to have a lot of operators, and this is a very simple model with circles versus the actual acreage footprints. But in any case, we're going to see a lot of development along this corridor. And of course, it's going to start in the corridor. It's going to start where we're familiar with the data, where we're comfortable with the operations, building off everyone else's successes. And then it's going to expand, just like in oil and gas. It started with the easy things, and then it's moved to the more difficult things. Extraction is going to be there, and the technologies are already supportive. We've got horizontal drilling. We've got all kinds of other technologies that can help in development. So what is it going to look like? Well, this is the last impression I want to give you, is that once we get the midstream in here and we start getting some operational facilities, whether they be small, whether they be large, and there's certainly room for all sizes and all types. But in any case, you're going to come in here, you're going to build a facility, you're going to have a network of pipeline to the wells, and the well fields are going to be providing brine. They're going to be different operators all working together to feed these facilities. Once you feed these facilities, once you extract the lithium, once you go through the conversion process and purification, then of course you have something for the downstream. And now you start to reduce our dependency on imports, and you start to create energy security for the United States. And of course, throughout this entire area, you're going to have the ability to expand and to build additional ones. Now, companies like ExxonMobil may be able to do that independently and all on their own because of their unique position in Arkansas, but that's not going to be the case for everyone else. And so again, I go back to the co-opetition that's going to take place, and it's going to emulate, I think, the oil and gas model, and it could look something like this. So last thing I'll answer is who are we in Texas? You won't find Galvanic Energy out there in Texas, but we actually operate through our subsidiaries and various prospects and plays. Our prospect in Northeast Texas is called Bright Star Exploration. And the Bright Star name comes from paying homage to the local area that was originally known as Bright Star, Texas, prior to statehood. And so we give credit to the name, to the local communities in which we operate. And so with that, look forward to our panel discussions and answering any questions for you a little bit later.